Once again for coming to the weekly Crow Canyon webinar, our Thursday webinar. We've got a great talk lined up for you today. But before I introduce our speaker, we are going to give a land acknowledgement and some further information, as we always do. So the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center acknowledges the Pueblo, Ute, Paiute, Dene, and Jicarilla Apache, people on whose traditional homelands this institution sits. Our work would not be possible without Indigenous people in the past, present, and future. We respectfully recognize and honor ancestral and descendant Indigenous communities for their contributions to all humankind. Crow Canyon is grateful to all Indigenous people and supports the preservation and protection of cultural traditions, ancestral connections, and sacred lands. Again, I know we've done a lot of Zooming in these past few years, but we always give this reminder, please, 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 if you have any questions, be sure to put them in the Q&A, what's circled in red here on this slide. Don't put them in the chat. Don't put your questions in the chat. The chat is for chatting, okay? The Q&A so we can look at them, and we will try to get to as many as we can within our allotted time. If you have any issues with Zoom, remember, we're also streaming over on Facebook, and you can also see our talks on YouTube a day or so after this this presentation. Okay, we've got a couple of great webinars lined up for you. So next week is Caretakers of the Land, a story of farming and community and San Xavier, I believe. I'm going to say Xavier for that one. And then the next week, we have Ink and Identity, exploring the history of Indigenous tattoo traditions in the United States Southwest. That sounds really, really cool. So please join us for both of these awesome webinars. And also, as always, we just want to make sure you know that we greatly appreciate your support here at Crow Canyon. We partially run on donations. If you want to consider supporting our initiatives here at Crow Canyon, you can scan this QR code down in the corner. I will leave it here for a couple beats. If you wish to do so, you can also just visit our website and see what we're up to and if there's anything you'd like to support. And if so, we really appreciate it. So, okay, 3, 2, 1. Another thing that we just wanted to point out is checking out Dr. Susan Ryan's latest blog post about LIDAR here in the Central Mesa Verde region and archaeological research in general. Really, really cool. You can see that on our website too. The URL down there is at the bottom. You can just go to news@crowcanyon.org and check it out. Okay, so let's introduce today's speaker. So today's speaker is Dr. John Douglas. John is an anthropological archaeologist with diverse experiences and interests. He earned a doctorate at the University of Arizona in 1990. Now a professor in anthropology, he has been employed since 1991 at the University of Montana, or Missoula. His foremost area of expertise is the native people and archaeology of Northwest Mexico and the U.S. Southwest. He has also worked in Belize, Brazil, the Central African Republic, and France. He is a pioneer in examining the archaeology of far southeast Arizona and northeast Sonora, conducting both survey and excavation there. So his long-term research on the U.S.-Mexico borderlands has focused on regional interaction during population aggregation and the ascendancy of Paquimé, the ancient center in present-day Chihuahua, which is what he's going to talk to us a little bit about today. So now I'm going to turn it over to you, John. The stage is yours.
All righty. Well, let me share my screen here. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you everyone for joining. Let's see if I've picked the right one to share. And it looks like I have.
You're coming through clear.
Okay. So you can see that we're going to talk about that borderland area. We're going to talk about the Casas Grandes Valley. I'm going to give you a little bit of background on Paquimé, and we're going to spend most of today's talk on really a new subject for me, looking at the indigenous people that the Spanish met in the valley and how they might relate to Paquimé. We're going to spend a fair amount of time on an introduction here. I want to make sure everyone understands the geography, the cultures, the timelines. But then I'm going to introduce a hypothesis, and we're going to test that hypothesis by looking at some data, and then look at the consequences of that. And I will try to keep focused on this introduction and not let it run too long here. So if we think about this huge area that ranges from Durango, Colorado to Durango, Mexico, that I like to call the Northwest, Southwest, whatever name you call it. It's a very varied land. And when we think about it, in a general sense, we think about how well we understand this region, maybe compared to some other areas in the world. And that falls apart just a little bit when we think about the international four corners, the southern part of this area, the place where the Mexican states of Sonora and Chihuahua, Arizona, and New Mexico, United States, meet up. And why is that? Why don't we understand this as well? Well, there's lots of factors involved, but one that people working the area often point to first is the small number of researchers compared to the U.S. Four Corners, more or less out in the backyard of Crow Canyon, and the small number of projects. And that certainly is a factor. But today I want to take a sort of a different tact. I want us to think about Indigenous people and how they relate to the record of the international four corners. For the most part, Indigenous participation is rare in Northwest Mexico. Even documentary evidence that we're going to be dealing with today tends to get siloed into studies of the colonial period and not thought too deeply about with the ancient past. And I think that limits our understanding. So I think an essential mission today is I want to argue that Indigenous voices are essential for our grasp of Northwest Mexico archaeology. And we're going to use the Suma of the Casas Grandes Valley as a case example. So since we're going to focus it on Indigenous people, here is an old map from the Smithsonian. Here's our international four corners right up here, and we're looking at northern Mexico. And you'll notice a lot of these names are going to be unfamiliar to you. There's some groups like the Raramuri or the Tarahumara who have retained their communities and their ways of life, and they're relatively well known. There are other groups like our focus today, the Suma. We don't even know the indigenous name for the Suma. Suma is a Spanish name that we have a much hazier knowledge of, and hopefully we will at least light a candle with all of that. I want to talk about some of the important places we're going to talk about, and just a thumbnail about the geography here. The Casas Grandes Valley, which I'm going to call the CGV fairly often in today's talk, is the drainage between the rugged Sierra Madre Occidental that scrapes off a lot of rain and snow and runs off into the Casas Grandes Valley. And it's surrounded by areas that are not as well watered. There is, in fact, a Rio Casas Grandes that flows through this area. And for something like 400 years, people have been noting the CGV has some of the best agricultural and ranching potential in the area. So it's not a coincidence that we also have substantial ancient communities. And the largest of these, the center of all these, is Paquimé, sometimes, less frequently today, called Casas Grandes. So here's my rough map here. Here is our international four corners. You can see they don't line up as nicely as the US four corners. The mountain range is running between Sonora and Chihuahua. Here's our north flowing rivers, and here's Paquimé located right down here. About 3 miles north is the Mission San Antonio, which is important for our understanding of the Suma, to be discussed quite a bit later on in this talk. I'll also mention Janos, the site of a presidio, and we'll mention that as well. And we're also going to talk a little bit about the Carretas Basin. We're going to look at this very western edge of the larger Casas Grandes area. And at its height, the Paquimé, all of this area looks like it's pretty strongly influenced by this center. Paquimé defies brief mention, but I'm going to give it my best. I've got 5 things here for you to know that will get you started if you don't know about this site. One is it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. There's only 2 in the northwest, southwest. The other one's Chaco Canyon. So clearly, Paquimé keeps good company. The other is that most of the site consists of these incredible overbuilt adobe room blocks that stood up to 3 stories high. There's all these vigas from pines that they're bringing out in the mountains. There's 1,000 or so rooms there. It's pretty remarkable. And then a few of these rooms contain these vast sums of items like marine shell jewelry and copper objects. This site is clearly the center of something, and 3 and 4 get at that. One is there are some elaborate public and ritual features, which I'm not going to run through them all, but the mounds that have astronomical alignment are pretty cool. And then we also have a Mesoamerican style ball court that's quite remarkable. And then Paquimé does not, number 4, it doesn't stand alone. If you read the older literature, it sounds like that. If you read Paul Minnis and Mike Whalen, you'll know that there is a lively settlement system in the Casas Grandes Valley. And my 5th point is about that older literature, and we'll be mining the hard work of the Joint Casas Grandes Expedition, the JCGE, for this lecture. The JCGE excavated at Paquimé between 1959 and 1961. It was truly an international expedition, but Charles Di Peso truly was the spark plug. And in the end, published 8 large volumes on the valley that remain highly cited to this day. We're just going to give you 3. I'm just going to give you 3 pictures to hold on to if you don't know Paquimé. I hope you have other ones in the back of your head. Here is this massive construction. Here I am in the late 1980s, providing a 5'8" scale to just how big these are. I throw this in part because I'm going to mention this trip in a little bit later in this talk. If you want to think about public features, the agave roasting pit, I think it's the largest one in the Northwest Southwest. If you had lots of visitors, you could prepare a lot of food or drink for them with that. And then this is from a book, but the pottery is truly remarkable, produced by specialists with a lot of iconographic content. All right, so with that very brief thumbnail sketch, we can think about the timeline, slicing and dicing the record the way archaeologists do. Our real focus here is this Tardio period on top, between about AD 1450 and 1664, after Paquimé ceases to exist and before the mission, which was founded in 1664, completed in 1667. So what comes before? Well, we have horticultural villages and pit house structures. making ceramics going back to at least 700 AD or CE. Around 1200, Paquimé, as we know it, is founded, and it becomes some kind of center. But its most elaborate demonstration comes after 1300, those really fancy ceramics. All of that seems to fall after 1300 and runs up to, say, 1425. This 25-year period, I don't think I've seen anyone else say it's 25 years, so take that with a grain of salt. But we do have a period where most building ceases. There's a little bit of space reorganization. Areas get walled in, that sort of thing. And then we get ritual deposits, and some of these are termination related, and those dominate. And then between 1450 and 1664, we have this Tardio period. Now, how do we fill this Tardio period? Well, the short answer is we don't have a very good picture of it yet. And so I'm going to have to do a little bit of history of archaeology here with you. If you look at the Di Peso report, 74, he sees, and the team as a whole sees, that the Tardio period was the result of collapse of Paquimé and then replacement. So Paquimé was attacked, survivors fled to distant places, and the Casas Grandes Valley was completely abandoned. And Di Peso never puts time on this, but reading it, it seems really instantaneous by archaeological standards. Some years or decades later, an unrelated hunting group, here's that name again, the Suma, we're going to be building a different understanding of them in a bit, move into this empty valley. Now, what do we have to hang on to for this period? Well, there's really a 2-page eyewitness report is what we have to hang on. Mexico-born Baltasar Obregon, his dad was a conquistador with Cortez, brought his wife over. So he was born in Mexico. He described the Casas Grandes Valley indigenous people, and he met with them in 1565. But what about archaeology? This is an archaeology group. We don't have any archaeology that the JCGE identified. They didn't do survey. And you get the feeling that they did not think it was likely to be able to find the very ephemeral remains that they expected. Now, beginning around 2000, we start seeing an alternative take on the Tardio period develop. And I think this starts with the recognition that Paquimé was not abandoned after a pitched battle, but was abandoned ritually. And these interpretations, we can thank William Walker, for his interest in ritual activities that might have closed the site, and especially ritually important spots on the site. Previously had been thought to be the Vandals had gotten in and had scattered things around. And the human remains that the JCGE thought were battle casualties were looked at by a bioarchaeologist named Chris Casarino, and in his PhD, he suggests they look more like ritually processed offerings than they do battle casualties. I would say, such interpretations suggest some protracted activities after Paquimé is no longer a center. But who's around to perform these rituals? Remember, Di Peso thought the valley was completely abandoned. Well, in the last decade or so, some scholars have initially fairly, with a fair amount of caution, have suggested that small farming sites may have lasted into the Tardio period. This is a world, unlike the real Four Corners, that we're using radiocarbon dates to date all of these things. And there's enough overlap that we think that there could be Tardio period villages. How long they lasted, nobody has yet published on, but we'll take up this issue of Tardio period agricultural villages in a little bit. We have one last and pretty large introduction, and that is the Suma themselves. And so we're going to sketch this on the written understanding that we have. So the name Suma appears in official Spanish writings from the 17th century to the mid-18th century, so up to about 1750 or so. The labels apply primarily to people in a crescent-shaped band across northern Chihuahua. That ranges from the Rio Grande to the east, the Casas Grandes Valley to the west, and the record is entirely anecdotal. There's no detailed description here. So what do we have going on here? Well, here's that same map again, but I've colored in the Suma territory for you. Here they are stretched along the Rio Grande. We know they overlap, in fact, with other groups that are mentioned by the Spanish, but they seem to have the western part to themselves, and here they are in the Casas Grandes Valley drainage. Who the Suma are is really confusing, and people have been grappling with this for a long time. And I could get really bogged down in this, but I am just going to say there are three scenarios that people have suggested over the years. In one scenario, the Suma is a Spanish label that is assigned to different people with different practices or attributes. Maybe they tattooed their faces to tie into next week's talk, and that the term really doesn't tell us anything about ethnicity at all. Another scenario is the Suma were a varied group, but they surely shared some kind of language and an origin, but we allow for a fair amount of variation with these groups. The third scenario is that the Suma were a distinct ethnic group, and the practices that were attributed to them includes a hunting and gathering focus, a high mobility, and small group size. Now, I am going to come down on saying that I have some misgivings about scenario 3, and we'll explore why as this talk goes on. This idea that they were a far-flung hunting and gathering group fits the replacement model quite nicely. It's that view that the Suma came in after Paquimé closed down. But as we're going to see, there's some evidence to distinguish the Western and Eastern Suma. We'll get to that later. And we lack any compelling reason to reject scenario 1 and 2. So we're just going to set aside this whole model of Suma, unity that scenario 3 implies. Maybe not, because I want to consider local emergence of the Casas Grandes Valley Suma, and that would mean that the Eastern and Western Suma might have split apart a long time ago, or perhaps even not related at all. But we won't be looking at those questions today. So what happens to the Suma? Well, there are a number of great historical analyses and anthropological analyses that shows how this colonial period, the epidemics, famine during some low rainfall years, the high rates of warfare, the labor demands. Chihuahua was focused on silver production at this time, and the mines were really tough. The group dislocations that occurred really brutally reduced indigenous populations all over present-day Chihuahua. What happens to the surviving Suma that we know about? Well, some seem to ally and later join up with the Apache. It's unclear to me if these are Eastern or Western Suma, but certainly there is an alliance between some Suma and the Apaches in the 18th century. and they do seem to join. Other groups seem to be forced off their land, but they remain in the orbit of missions and presidios. But I think a key reason why the Suma seemed to suddenly drop off the map about 1750, with only just a few references to them later on, is because the way the records are kept changes. Ethnic identity is changing in Spain going into the nation of Mexico, and we get more of a caste system where indigenous descendants are called mestizo. And with group membership no longer officially recorded, the Suma seem to disappear very quickly, probably more quickly than they actually disappeared. All right, that is my long introduction. And now we're going to take a look at the hypothesis that we're going to look at. And I'm sure many of you have anticipated this hypothesis, and that is that despite long-held views, evidence exists that the Casas Grandes Valley Suma were related to the inhabitants of Paquimé or the surrounding settlements. So we're going to look at that. And so if we can verify the statement, then the perceived gap between the ancient great houses and the historic written record of the Suma really has to be reconsidered. Now I'm going to take a little detour before getting into the data here, and that is I'm just going to answer the question, how did I come to explore this hypothesis? And it has a long history for me, although I count this as a recent project for me. Back in the late 1980s, I was writing this dissertation at the University of Arizona that you heard about before, and I was analyzing far southeastern Arizona in the context of the Casas Grandes region. It was a periphery, and all that term entails. Given that project, I wanted to visit the core, and I wanted to visit Paquimé. And so I joined a tour led by a prominent Casas Grandes Valley scholar named Paul Minnis, who has just been tremendous about doing public tours of the site. And that was great. I got my picture snapped in front of the walls there, as you know. And then I asked Paul if we could go see the mission. I thought that would be cool to do. And there's quite a bit of archaeology in that area. So on arriving, I was struck by the church ruins. They just seemed too grand for Di Peso's simple Suma. That was sort of a gut feeling that I had because I was familiar with Di Peso's writings on the matter. So I got back to Tucson and I started doing research on the Suma until I sort of slapped my forehead and said, I have a PhD to write here, maybe someday. And guess what? In 2021, someday arrived. I had a sabbatical, and that provided an opportunity to start thinking about Suma history. So obviously, thanks to Paul Minnis, thanks to my university for the sabbatical, but I also want to thank the Ameren Foundation, who made me a visiting scholar and let me see the site records for the excavations at the mission, and former President Chris Suter and current President Eric Cadell were so helpful. I want to thank the co-author of the American Antiquity article in 2023 that I'm shamelessly ripping off today. That is Linda Brown. Linda and I are a married couple. We've done a lot of archaeology together, but this is our first journal article together. So she shares in this interpretation. And then finally, this is all new to us. Reviewers were wonderful and incredibly helpful. I'd particularly shout out John Ravensloot, who helped me understand the JCGE excavations and how it fit into everything. All right. All right, so detour is over, and we can talk about what evidence might support this hypothesis that there's connections. Well, one, as I'd say, is that evidence of the Suma farm, that they lived in substantial settlements, or even if they cycled between different mobility patterns, because we know in the rancheria groups in the southern northwest, southwest. That was a common pattern. I would also, of course, point to any kind of shared material cultural practices between Paquimé and the Suma. What evidence might we look at? Well, Spanish era documents, which I looked at, many of the library at the Amarin, and then the archaeological record itself. And today that primarily consists of the archaeological work conducted by the JCGE in 1959 at Mission San Antonio de Palda de Casas Grandes, known locally as the Convento Site, because that is the full mission name is rather long. So let's talk data here. And I have three kinds of data, or I have two kinds of data, and I have three different colonial text information that I want to familiarize you with. One is this character Obregon and his interpretations. Obregon was a soldier in the 1564 to 1565 Iberra expedition. Iberra is the person who conducted the expedition, who left us no detailed written record. Obregon wrote the first description of Paquimé. It's truly wonderful. And he also wrote a description of the unnamed people of the CJV, generally assumed to be the Suma. He noted that these people were rustica, and he emphasized their hunting economy. They were cazadores. So certainly he hits this note of them being really primitive that later anthropologists attach themselves to. But there is this one use of a verb in his description that got me thinking, and that is he ties them to the old sizable structures in the valley. He notes that they had stopped living in houses of such grandeur. He uses the verb debahar, to stop. And that means at one time he thought they lived in those grand houses. So he provides some kind of linkage between the ancient history and the contemporary people that I think needs to be pulled out of his overall description of them as hunter-gatherers. Now, evaluating Obregon's account is tricky. The military expedition visited briefly and lacked a translator. He wrote this account 19 years after he was there. So he basically was there when he was 20, he wrote it when he was 40. And this description is embedded in a treatise that was written to build a status in the colonial system to earn an honor that he didn't get in the end. And it certainly contains some known biases. So we have to be a little careful with this. I think we're on more solid ground when it comes to Jesuit missionaries. And these Jesuit comments are the only mission-related statements of the Western Suma that we have. In the 1650s, there's still no mission in the CGV. Some Jesuits who were living in Sonora with the Opata indigenous people cross over the mountain pass, and they prophesize among Suma in the Carachas Basin. Remember, that's the very western edge of the CGV. And in doing so, they end up baptizing 180 families. 4 or 5 people per family. We might be up to 800 to 1,000 people that they are working with. And they establish a visita. Think of a little chapel with no permanent priest there. And they are pretty struck by this group of people. And they definitely distinguish them from what they know of the mobile Eastern Suma along the Rio Grande. So we have the great 19th century pioneer anthropologist Adolphe Bandelier, who's read these Jesuit accounts. And he writes the CGV Suma were different from their brethren that roamed near the Rio Grande, and it seemed they've been more stable settlements of theirs. Both Bandelier and I think there's probably some agriculture going on here, although the Jesuits weren't interested in that and do not mention that. But sizable population, and they mention that they're more settled. The third document that I want to talk about today is, I think, the most important one, and that is where the Suma actually give us their origins. Well, how did that come about? Well, in the one of the effects of the Great Pueblo Revolt of 1680 and the Spanish colonists that were kicked out of the Upper Rio Grande was that some of them moved into the Casas Grandes Valley. And we know from official accounts that they actually forced Suma out of their homes and took over their farmland. This led to rebellion, but it also led to a legal action at the same time. And in this document, we have this remarkable statement: these lands and waters which are present are subject to dispute, used to be ours, of our fathers and ancestors, on which we have been born and raised, and we want them back. The filing also identifies where their farmlands are. We can, using landmarks that we know today. So we know where their farmlands were. It gives them specific pastures for both large and small animals. It tells us where they could collect firewood. All this was covered under the treaty. Now, 1687 is just about 25 years since the mission has been formed. And so what looks like we're dealing with settled farmers in this area. Intriguingly, this document was not known about until the late 1960s, and its impact was not as great as I think it should have had. I'll talk more about that, but it certainly suggests the Suma were an enduring farming group in the Casas Grandes Valley. So I think there's documentary evidence to support that connection. There's also interesting archaeology that I want to talk about as well. And the first of these is a specific artifact type called large cylinders. Cylindrical groundstone objects are found throughout the Northwest, Southwest, but these are big guys. These are 2 to 3 feet long, and they're 4 to 6 inches in diameter. They're nicely made, very symmetrical. They do not look functional. They look like something special, ceremonial, and we find them at Paquimé in contexts that don't allow us to determine what their use is. Intriguingly for us, there are 3 of these buried vertically under the corners of the mission's foundation. I'm going to show you one in just a moment. And another one is buried flat next to the choir loft. The JCGE thought these were construction markers. But why didn't they just use wooden markers? Let me show you what I mean. Let's look at this picture. Here is the Convento Site. This is the mission. Here's the church back here. You can see the adobe blocks that make it up. Here's the plaza over here. The walled cemetery was located over here. This is one of the rooms that the friars and their crew would have used. And at this corner, there is this green andesite cylinder that's 2 feet long, buried way underneath the stone foundation. It weighs 17 pounds, and it looks like an unlikely stake to me. I have a different idea of what this all might mean, and that these might be dedicatory offerings. Let's look at the map. Here's our overall map of the site. Here's this northeast corner stone. Here's one in the northwest corner. This is a later addition that you're seeing that bump out there. There's another upright stone in the southeast corner. I think the southwest corner wasn't found. They didn't do much excavation. All of this was stripped. This was not. A few trenches were put in here. So I have an explanation for that. And then this horizontal one is right by this. This is the staircase that leads you up to a choir loft that would have spanned the back of the church. So what could this be? Well, I think it could be a Mesoamerican style offering that reflects a view of the world. So we've got the four sacred directions here, and then the central axis, the axis mundi, or the world tree that unites different worlds together. So I think this is right out of the playbook of Mesoamerican sacred structures, happening in the 17th century at a Catholic church building. And I think the builders, who would have been indigenous, are infusing symbolic meaning to this structure. On a more practical level, I look at the choir staircase itself. The staircase shows some physical similarities to several staircases at Paquimé. Notably, it's made out of puddled adobe. You already saw that most of the mission was built out of Spanish-style adobe blocks. And this use of tamp puddled adobe is suggestive of Paquimé-style construction. We also have the fact that a heavy-duty big staircase like this with puddled adobe is really rare in northern frontier missions. And most of these mission churches have ladders or wooden steps. So taking an illustration from my and Linda's article, here is the mission steps. They go up to a landing, they turn a direction, and then they lead up to what would have been the choir loft, but that's burned and is now vacant space. You can see this massive puddled adobe. You can see strips of wood that define these steps. And we flip over to a drawing of the Paquimé, and we see again massive puddled adobe and strips of wood that produce them. The Acoma mission shows a lot of similarities with Mission San Antonio, but not in the staircase. The Acoma staircase, 30 years older, is wooden treads that are mounted between two narrow walls. And so it is quite different. I have one more archaeological thing to show you, and that is the mass burial. This occurs in this room right here. This is church room 1. It had a doorway to the cemetery. It was probably a cemetery, a mortuary chapel. Later on, we know dozens of bodies were placed inside of it. In the field, it was thought to be an indigenous feature, a reuse of the church that the Franciscans left. But in the intervening years, Di Peso learned a lot because of all the archive work that he helped initiate. He learned a lot about a case where a group of Suma leaders were tried and then sentenced to death. And he began to hypothesize that this was the grave of these Suma leaders. And in doing so, he really rewrote what the deposit looked like. He started thinking that they were all laid out together and stacked like cordwood, and that they were covered with large rocks. But I'm here to tell you that this drawing, based on that reconfiguration of what happened, really doesn't have any bearings to the actual field notes that we have. So when you look at the photos and field notes, you see that the main burial is a heap of human remains intermixed with long bones of perhaps cattle or horse or perhaps other animals. And they were covered with broken metates, which were not collected either. And then, interesting enough, along the inner wall against the church, 9 skulls were lined up along one wall, all facing the same direction, apart from this larger mound. And we don't know much about this. The Catholic Church intervened and said, you know, it's not cool to have these dug up. And Di Peso listened to them. And so after the photography was done, the area was backfilled. So we don't have osteological information. However, I can tell you this doesn't fit any Spanish practices that I know of. If you do, I would be very, very interested. Um, this use of architectural space for burial, the mixing of quadruped leg bones with human remains is something we see at Paquimé. The special treatment of skulls, all of this seems very Paquimé-like. So what do we conclude? We conclude that key documents spanning a century suggest that the Casas Grandes Valley Suma had regional roots and sometimes stable settlements, and very likely farming. At least some of the time, apparently not when Obregon was there. Aspects of the mission architecture and the mass burial suggest continuities of the Casas Grandes culture. I can't fit all the archaeological data that I could talk about in today's presentation, but I do want to note that Marco Martinez Galicia wrote a thesis supervised by Mike Whalen. He worked on some of the recent work, and they compared ancient Casas Grandes ceramics with Suma ceramics, and they found all kinds of continuities and came to this conclusion that I'm going to state right now, that there's likely some kind of connection between the ancient past and the CGV Suma as known in the 17th century. What are the implications for archaeology? Well, I would say, number one, that those scholars suggesting that farming villages might have survived Paquimé are supported, and I'm sure we're going to see that work continue on that possibility. More philosophically, we can see how the long-term indigenous resilience and continuities are occurring over centuries, and that is truly remarkable as well. Thirdly, I would simply say there's a lot of discussion in archaeology of the International Four Corners and beyond about what happens at 1450. Because we've got the classic Hohokam, the Salado, the Trincheras, Casas Grandes, all these grand cultures seemingly disappearing. And what happens next? Well, we're slowly piecing that together with probably the Hohokam picture, the strongest right now. But here's some new evidence that we have. But there's a lot more work to do. How did the Suma rise out of what we know is a stratified multi-ethnic society that existed there when Paquimé was booming? Who do the Suma really represent? I think that's an open question in this case. What are the cultural trajectories during the Tardio period? Remember, we have hardly any archaeology. We need a lot more archaeological work to figure all of that out. I've got just a couple of closing thoughts here. One is the quote from that legal document is so good I have to read it twice. These lands and waters used to be ours, our fathers and ancestors, on which we have been born and raised. It's a really lucid account of origins. It's the only account that we really have, yet it was really overlooked. At one point, we were talking about what to call our paper, and Linda suggested we call it We Know, or They Knew, excuse me, referring to this quote. They knew who they were. But that tended to get ignored. To loop back to the introduction, and I hope I've made this point, that we need to pay attention to Indigenous voices and their history to understand the ancient people of Casas Grandes Valley. This is not just mission and colonial archaeology. It needs to interconnect with the ancient stuff as well. I'm going to anticipate one possible question here, and that is, are there Suma today? I don't know. Of course, that's not an indigenous name at all, but they're probably descendants of the Casas Grandes culture still in the region. But I should mention that the CGV was almost completely abandoned during the Apache conflicts. We do know that some Suma moved to Janos, as I mentioned before, nearby military outposts, and the possibility of people shifting into the mountains, a very old pattern in this area to escape problems, are really possible, and then people coming back in when things cooled off. Official archives simply don't address Suma survival and on that sort of small group level. So lots still to think about and do with all of this. But I just want to say thank you all for your interest.
Thank you so much, John. That was fantastic. We've got questions rolling in right now, so we can get started. Um, One of the questions that popped up was, given that the Spaniards really didn't understand like who they were talking to or what the Suma are, do you agree with that as a label, the Suma as a label, and this kind of, do you think, how are we fitting data to certain things?
I don't think my big sigh was quite loud enough to be heard, but I, I don't like the label, but calling them Group Z also has its problems as well, and so um, I don't know what that label means. Suma means some. There's even been the suggestion that maybe Suma just sort of means riffraff. It's the people that you can't fit into any other category. Um, nobody really knows. Nobody really knows. So I'm uncomfortable with it. And but I don't see what my option is right now. If people have suggestions, let me know.
Gotcha. One of the things too that popped up in the Q&A here is, what about using DNA evidence and or ancient DNA evidence? And I'm wondering too, within this, if you could maybe talk about the ethics surrounding DNA work.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a natural part of this. And is a fun fact that Dr. Meredith Snow teaches in my same department, who has been doing DNA analysis at Paquimé for a number of years. I do think DNA might answer the question but um, who you would get, who would be the group that you would want to talk to about all of this? Certainly the laws of Mexico are really different. So I also don't want to bring my legal framework into Mexico. I've worked there on the ground. I worked in Sonora on the ground many years ago, but I've not worked with the folks in Chihuahua. What those issues would be, I'm not sure. But there is a few, although most of the skeletons were from the mission were left in the ground, a few were collected. Potentially they could be tested, but I will leave it to the biological anthropologist and Ina Chihuahua to think of what the best path forward would be with all of that.
One question we have as well is, did you transcribe and translate documents yourself, or did you read a translation someone else made?
My Spanish abilities would not allow me to work on these ancient or these old texts. So I am really relying on some really great work. De Peso helped facilitate taking the entire collection of records and digitizing them. So I'm relying on what those scholars have written. And I will say that business about stopped. The standard English translation of Obregon's work does not include the word stopped, and that comes from me looking at it and thinking about it. So, but I'm not a ethnohistorian.
Gotcha. One interesting question, maybe especially related to what you were talking about with continuity with ceramics.
Mm-hmm.
Do the Suma have diagnostic artifacts specific to them or the time period?
That is, that's a tough one. And one thing that I didn't get into is the whole question of we do have some surrounding areas where the Sumer were living around the mission. And, you know, the problem with the original work with that is, well, there's a couple problems. One is they had about 1,000 years of archaeology, and so there's a lot of mixing of cultural material. Um, so the diagnostics end up being the historical artifacts. Um, you know, I would say, you know, and based on some statements that Mike Wayland and a student have made, I'm not sure that we can separate out Suma planeware vessels with ancient vessels. And I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done on that.
Awesome. So we have a pretty broad question here. And so this person says, as far as I know, Mesoamerican trade to sites like Paquimé is generally considered to be direct trade to southern Mexico. Is the area or culture more narrowed down than that? Such as if it's the Maya region cultures versus the Isthmus area and groups like the Zapotec or Totonac.
Yeah, you know, boy, I mean, uh, that gets me into subjects that are really remote from our focus here. Um, and you know, there is one view that West Mexico is sort of um, the gatekeeper here, and the copper was made in West Mexico, or a lot of it at least was. But you know, there seems to be some broader things going on as well. And I would, I would say that we don't have that pinned down, but it's something that really animates a lot of research for Paquimé today.
Gotcha. Okay, well, now we have a specific question. So, what about Viegra's account of Casas Grandes and the indigenous people Oñate encountered there? Sure, there were people, Suma, in the valley, but they disavowed connections to Paquimé, and they had detailed stories about Paquimé, including the Casas Grandes meteor, not discovered for many decades later. I think you can trust Viegra, other historians do.
Okay, so I mean, Obregon, I think is the source of that material. So Obregon sits down with the folks, and they can't talk. Their translator had run off some weeks earlier, and um, he, through sign language, Obregon says that he asked who had produced these mounds and what happened to them. And there is this account of a big fight and people moving, I think it's 4 days to the north, which gets us all going, okay, so where did they go? Um, I've chosen to ignore, I mean, one is, I mean, clearly I've given you the pieces of the accounts that most clearly seem to suggest some continuity. But I'd also say that we know that people from different areas are coming into the Casas Grandes Valley from recent research by bioarchaeologists. We know that this area is heavily stratified. So let's assume that Obregon got it right, that this, you know, there's no mess up in the communication here. We still could have a case where the people that are being discussed are the leading families in this group, and they fled, and other people in the valley remained. And so that's why I think it's important. That's where I'm coming from in saying we don't really know who the Suma are in this world. You know, are they the folks living in the fanciest houses in at Paquimé, or are they people who are living in villages around the edges of it? And if you start thinking about it in those terms of continuity, then the account that there was a battle and some people left doesn't negate the possibility of continuity. And and I think this is kind of some interesting parallels here with the Hohokam case and Akmelodam mythology and continuities and all of that sort of thing.
Okay. Well, John, that's our time. We want to be respectful of your time and others' time. So if you look at the chat right now, it's just blowing up with people saying what a wonderful presentation and thank you very much for your time. So and as on behalf of Crow Canyon, thank you so much for taking the time today to talk with us, and that was just fantastic.
Okay, well, thank you. I enjoyed it, and thank you, everybody.
Yep. All right. Have a good one, everyone.
Bye.